So this weekend, for Christians especially, we celebrated Good Friday on Friday, right? And then Passover was at Friday sundown. And then, of course, Sunday, you have Easter or Resurrection Sunday, when we remember Jesus rising from the dead on the third day after he was crucified. So if you grew up in a Christian home like I did, a lot of times, a lot of these things, maybe not so much the Passover, but a lot of the other things are very familiar. And maybe it starts to become business as usual, like every single year, because maybe that's the only time your parents go to church, or maybe that's the only time you see a lot of people at church. But has anyone ever asked you about the resurrection? Have you ever met somebody, whether it's a family member or a friend, who said to you, do you really believe that Jesus became alive again after he died?
No one
You know?
has ever asked.
And how do you answer that question? And then to take it even further, have you ever asked yourself that question? How you can believe something that from the outside looking in seems like a very out there proclamation that somebody actually became alive after dying. So I've said this many times before, and I'll say it again. Believing in something doesn't make it true. So Santa Claus, Tooth Fairy, just because the kid believes it doesn't mean that it's true. And on the flip side, whatever is actually true, it's going to be true whether you believe it or not, right? So this is why I think it's important for us to think about the resurrection, because it's such a cornerstone of what we say we believe in, of our Christian faith or our Christian worldview. So first, I wanted to kind of very quickly go through why the resurrection is so important. I just said it was a cornerstone of our faith. There's one passage, you all may have heard it. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 12 to 19. Probably every church mentioned it this past weekend. But I just want to read it very quickly and emphasize some of the things that Paul is saying here. He says, "Now if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. If the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. Then also those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied." I think those are very, very strong words. So what Paul does essentially is he ties the resurrection to everything that we believe in theologically. Basically, without the resurrection, Christianity is going to die, because that is what is a cornerstone of our faith. This maybe 2 weeks ago, I went to an apologetics conference locally to me. There was a guy named Craig Hazen. I don't know if you heard of him, but he puts it this way. He has studied world religions for his PhD in the University of Southern California, and he says that this passage is the most peculiar passage he's ever run into studying world religions and texts from any sacred text. And the reason he says that is because Paul is essentially hanging Christianity off of a thread that is the resurrection and inviting people to cut it if they can, just to test and see how strong the resurrection is.
Right.
And Paul's writing this knowing that God would preserve this evidence, this body of evidence, so that we today, centuries later, will still be able to have a firm faith that it actually happened. And not only that, but he mentions that there is no other world religion or worldview that has somebody rising from the dead as its foundation, as its leader. Right? So how do we go about answering these questions, and how do we know that Jesus actually rose from the dead? Before we go into the evidence, I think it's really important to first realize that you might be speaking to somebody who is coming into the table with a very strong presupposition of metaphysical naturalism, as basically that the world is an enclosed system, the universe is an enclosed system. It started and it continues to exist only through natural processes, nothing supernatural. So you can give them all the evidence as strong as you want about the resurrection, and they'll never believe it, because they'll come back and say, that sounds really compelling, but I just cannot believe in the supernatural. I cannot believe in miracles.
What do you think of these people?
Yeah, so I think there are ways to approach them. There are ways to kind of show, and I think first of all, there's a branch of apologetics that's called presuppositional apologetics, where the fact that a person is even able to reason or rationalize is kind of proof for God's existence in the first place, right? And there's a lot of things that they take for granted that transcends the natural realm that they still believe in and take for granted, things like love, things that you can't quantify through science. And if you're only looking at science and basing your entire life on science, then you're missing out on very real and very important things that truly exist in life, like morality, philosophy, love, mathematics, logic. Science presupposes logic, but it cannot prove logic. Same thing with mathematics. So yeah, was there something else you were thinking?
In terms, it's even. I mean, unless you dip into those matters as well, it's even worth arguing with someone like that, knowing that no matter how you put it around, they're not going to.
So one of the things I wanted to share was how you can go about opening someone's mind to just the possibility. So one of the things you can do is explain to them that if theism, that God actually exists, is even a remote possibility, then miracles are possible. And if miracles are possible, then the resurrection is possible. One of the stronger ones is that if the scholarly community, Christian or not, skeptic or not, critical or not, can all agree that the Big Bang in its essence is basically a universe coming from nothing, that in itself, already accepted by scholars, is the biggest miracle you'll ever find. How are you going to question the resurrection or any miracle in the Bible when those things pale in comparison to creating something out of nothing and creating life itself? So I think that's one of the biggest things, to just let them open up their mind. The other thing was, if scholars pretty much agree that Jesus was a miracle worker, he did miracles in his lifetime, that's the kind of atmosphere you would expect a resurrection to occur. Then the third thing was that was the third thing. The fourth thing was that if miracles probably really do happen today. So there is a body of scholarly work that documents and publishes miracles, modern day miracles. A lot of them are in the medical field, but there is a 2-volume work by Craig Keener, if you ever want to look into it.
By the way, you mentioned him the other day.
Did I?
He was my professor.
No way.
Yes, Craig Keener was my Revelation professor at Palmer Seminary.
Wow. Cool. So you have him on speed dial?
16 years ago.
That's crazy.
I spent 1 year in seminary.
He's doing some great things, though.
Craig Keener was my professor.
Did you?
He wrote a book on Revelation, the NIV.
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
I have it, and I still have his notes somewhere.
Very nice.
He's a very intense guy.
He is. Yeah.
Very intense. I'm talking, and I've never met anyone so intense.
So yes, that's pretty awesome. I wish I could say I had some pretty cool professors, but he is intense, and his content is very good. His 2-volume work is very recent, but it's become a classic already.
Yeah.
It just documents miracles and just the viability of miracles in terms of New Testament, in the context of the New Testament. So yeah, if we live in a world where miracles happen, why can't the resurrection happen? And the last thing was what I mentioned before. If transcendent things metaphysically exist, such as what I mentioned, logic, math, love, things like that, and if near-death experiences themselves testify to a soul, like consciousness does, and to an afterlife, then if these things are possible, then miracles, it's pretty hard to deny that miracles or the supernatural are at least possible. And if you can get someone to say, because you're not trying to get them to believe in the resurrection, you're just trying to get them to say, miracles are possible, let me hear what you have to say. And then you can go on to talk about the resurrection and some of the lines of evidence. So right now, having said that, the standard way in the past to defend the resurrection was to basically defend the reliability of the Bible and then say, this is a reliable book, it says Jesus resurrected. That's why I believe in the resurrection. It's a very solid method, and I do indeed believe that any Christian should be able to defend why they believe the Bible is reliable. In fact, the class that some of you guys know that I was just teaching at my church, which is done, thankfully, because it was a grueling 9-week class. 7 out of the 9 weeks we spent talking evidence for the reliability of the Bible, from manuscript evidence to his Old Testament transmission throughout the centuries and everything in between, including canon, how we got the Old and New Testament canon. So it's a very good thing to know this, but the problem, as you can see, is it's a lot of information. There is no way I could pack all that just today.
Right.
And the one of the drawbacks of using that is that when you start getting into the evidence and you're talking to someone who's not a Christian, or you just want to focus on the resurrection, it's very easy to go into tangents and rabbit trails, and next thing you know, you're talking about the Trinity, you're talking about alleged contradictions in the Bible. So there is another method of talking to people about the resurrection. It was developed and pioneered by a guy named Gary Habermas. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. He teaches at Liberty University right now. So his approach is called the minimal facts approach. Have you ever heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah, so Jonas has heard of it. So you can find details in this book. He co-wrote this with Michael Licona, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. So I use this in conjunction with this to teach about the resurrection. And what basically this does, minimal facts approach, it keeps the conversation of the Bible separately. You don't have to prove the Bible is true to prove that the resurrection is true. So what it does is it takes only data that is so strongly evidenced historically that virtually all scholars agree to these facts, whether you're Christian or not, skeptical or not. What he did was he compiled scholarly, peer-reviewed articles on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus from 1975 to the present in different languages, and he compiled the data for what their position was and what they assumed to be fact for a period of 5 years. And the point of this is that you're trying to find the lowest common denominator of agreed upon historical facts, regardless of whether a person is Christian or not. This is just based on scholarship. These are facts of history that almost 100% of people agree with. Then the next step would be, so what theory or explanation can we use to properly account for all of these facts? And we're going to kind of go into that later. And it's not that we will not use the Bible or New Testament as a source. We will still use the New Testament as a source, but the point is we're going to treat it like any other book of antiquity. It's not going to be divinely inspired. We're going to consider it like any other book. So Tacitus is one of the most reliable historians of that time, and people know that he was biased. In fact, he was biased against Christians. He was biased against Christianity, but he's still considered to be the most reliable historian there, and his work is still extremely great value. So that's what we're going to use the New Testament for. Now, the minimal facts approach is 5 facts. It's presented in the book as 4 plus 1 because one of the facts is only attested by 75% of scholars. The others are 98, 99%. But I still think 75% is a pretty strong majority and very much worth talking about. So I'll point out which one that is when we get to it. So any questions before I start talking about those 5 minimal facts?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Just is the reason I only know of this guy and so on. I go back to the Case of Christ book.
Yes.
Which, if you look at the bibliography of the Case of Christ book, that alone, you have a lifetime
Oh yeah.
of
Yeah.
reading for apologetics and things like
Right,
that. If you're
right.
interested in that
Yeah.
area, the methods that Lee Strobel used,
Yeah.
or like you said, scholars use to prove
Right.
the reliability of resurrection of the resurrection
Right.
outside of the Bible, but also I'm curious. I'm not getting ahead of you, but I'm curious how you would handle. Well, for you to believe in the resurrection, you have to believe that Christ existed.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And how do you have something on that as well?
So I could discuss that as a separate topic, but the very first point is that Jesus died by crucifixion. So it already assumes that most scholars know that Jesus was a real historical person. The very minor group of scholarship that thinks he wasn't real, they're typically called mythers. They think that he was a myth, or he is a figure that embodies something like an old religion, like from ancient Egypt or something. I think that stuff is very easily dispelled. We can talk about it if you want, but that doesn't hold a lot of ground, and it is a very small minority of scholars who will actually say that Jesus did not exist. If you look at guys like Bart Ehrman, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a New Testament scholar who is agnostic and is not a Christian, and he attacks the Bible.
Right.
Just the fact that his existence is testified by Tacitus and Josephus, we'll get more into them later, are sure evidences that Jesus truly did exist as a historical person. But yeah, so
Yeah, go
Jesus
ahead.
died by crucifixion. There's a lot in there already. The fact that, yes, Jesus was a historical person, it's such an established fact that we're not even putting that in its own category. The other thing was that crucifixion was a very torturous experience, right? So we know that medically, archaeologically speaking, and all the evidence that we have surrounding what we know about crucifixion, it is very unlikely that Jesus would have survived crucifixion. In fact, there's a quote I was going to read, but due to time, I'm not going to read it. Essentially, if Jesus didn't actually die, they call it the swoon theory. If he didn't actually die and he was in the tomb, then it would have been an even bigger miracle for him to move the stone or dig his way through, overpower the guards or sneak past the guards, find all the disciples. And if he was able to do that by some miracle, the disciples would not have said, "He is risen. Let's, this is the Jesus who resurrected from the dead." They would have basically taken him to like the nearest place to get medical attention. So it's very unlikely that Jesus survived crucifixion, and that is the scholarship consensus that he didn't. So some of the sources that support this, we have the 4 Gospels. We know that in the Gospels it says that Jesus' side was pierced to make sure he was dead. The centurion and Pontius Pilate both independently confirmed that he was dead. But also outside of the Gospels, there are 2 very strong sources in Tacitus, who we mentioned earlier. He was a Roman historian that is generally seen as the most reliable historian from that time. And Josephus, who you may have heard, was a Jewish historian. He was a Jewish scholar and soldier who defected to Rome and served the emperors there. He focused his scholarship on a lot of first century Jewish events, and both of these titans of history, of recording history, both attest to Jesus being alive, being a real person, and dying by crucifixion. There are specific quotes that I was going to read, but due to time, I'm not going to read them.
Right.
So anyway, you can take a look afterwards if you have time, and I can show it to you. But basically, I just wanted to read some of the quotes from skeptics about how you know what? I'm not going to read that either, just due to time. There's a whole column here of quotes of people like Bart Ehrman, Gary Luderman, other people who are very known atheist or agnostic New Testament scholars, who pretty much say there is no other more well-attested fact in the life of Jesus than the fact that he died by crucifixion. So you can take point number 1, minimal facts, to the bank and know that no one's really going to be able to contend with that.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
There is a text, there's a verse, I don't know if you have it on there, in Mark, where Pilate was surprised that Jesus had already died so soon.
Oh, right. I remember that.
It's somewhere in the Mark, maybe the last chapter of Mark. He was surprised when they came and told him that Jesus is already here. He was surprised,
Right.
because it's such an excruciating, slow death.
Yeah.
And God did not allow this to happen.
Right.
But the other 2 did.
Did what?
The 2 thieves
The-
that
the-
they
the
were
2
crucified at the same time with
Well,
him, correct?
they
did
were
die.
crucified, but it doesn't. The Bible doesn't say when they died, whether they died before Christ or after Christ.
No.
Well, the
but
Bible
Jesus
does-
said to the one on the right
You will
that
be
you're
with
gonna
me
be today.
with me today, but it doesn't say exactly. Okay, Christ died at 1 p.m.
So yeah.
They died at 3 p.m. or they died at
But
12:30 or
they
whatever.
did die the same day.
Sure.
Yeah, so what happened was Jesus was dead, and then who knows, I don't know exactly the timeline like Jonas said, but the Bible does record that they had to break the legs of the 2
There you go.
thieves or the other 2 criminals so that they can die, because when you're being crucified, it's you pushing up that allows you to breathe. And they've done scientific tests on these, that it's asphyxiation that will kill you, not loss of blood or anything. It's just sooner or later, just
You're not
breathing
gonna
will
be
be
able
too
to-
hard. And if you break someone's legs, dying would be better than breathing because it's so painful.
Right.
So this is like the medical aspect of how we know he likely didn't survive that.
Yeah.
So, but for the other 2, they had to break their legs in order for them to die. But they didn't break Jesus' legs because the Bible says he was already dead.
Yeah. And there was a prophecy about none of his
Yes,
bones
would be broken.
That's another thing
Right.
you might want to go into.
Right, that's true. So that was number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, the tomb was empty, or you can say there was a missing body. So this empty tomb is the +1 fact that 75% of scholars agree with. But when you just start talking it through, it's a very compelling piece of evidence too, and I'm really glad that they included it. So first of all, there's this thing called the Jerusalem factor, where Jesus was publicly executed in Jerusalem. And everything I'm going to say from here on out, I'm going to be emphasizing the word publicly. Jesus was publicly executed. His post-mortem appearances and the empty tomb testimonies were all public in Jerusalem during that time, weeks after the crucifixion. And if the tomb was not empty, the enemies of Jesus, all they had to do was publicly exhume the body and publicly show it for everyone to see. It would have been very impossible for Christianity to grow the way it did from Jerusalem, where everything was done out in the open, everything was done publicly. In fact, if the resurrection was a lie, you would expect it to gain traction in a place that is geographically separate from where everything was done publicly, maybe like Antioch or something. But in fact, that's not what happens. It's in Jerusalem where all of these things could have been seen for anybody. There are multiple testimonies. We have the Gospels, the sermons in Acts, the creeds that Paul has, the creeds that Paul's saying in his letters. But there's also enemy testimony. So not just Christian sources, but non-Christian sources indirectly testify to the empty tomb. Very quickly, let me just read this. It says, "If your mother says that you are an honest person, we may have reason to believe her, yet with reservation, since she loves you and is somewhat biased. However, if someone who hates you admits that you are an honest person, we have a stronger reason to believe what is being asserted, since potential biases do not exist." Right? So rather than pointing to an empty tomb, which they could have done, instead, they accuse Jesus' disciples of stealing the body. This is recorded in Matthew 28, verse 12 to 13. Again, I'm not going to read it, but they basically don't say, oh, the body's right there, but they accuse them and try to come up with an alternate reason that supports their position. In addition, there's a palpable lack of alternative stories or explanations. So, for example, in Acts 2, you remember Pentecost when Peter's giving his sermon. He is in Jerusalem in front of so many people who were there and eyewitnesses to everything that just happened to Jesus. And as he was proclaiming that Jesus was risen from the dead, nobody refutes him. Nobody. Because it was common knowledge that the tomb was empty and all the evidence was right there for anybody to see. And also, the enemies of Jesus had every opportunity to disprove them if it were possible, but instead they beat them, they threatened them, they put them in prison. And it would have been much easier to just say, look, here's the body. But so that's why I think this is a pretty strong one, that the tomb was empty. The bottom line is the enemies of Jesus did not deny it. So that is very strong.
From the resurrection to Pentecost, how much time is it?
50 days.
And also, Pentecost was actually already one of the feasts of Israel. It was just given new meaning. Or the meaning was fully exposed in Acts, in the New Testament. So besides that, there was the testimony of women, which we won't go into, but it's another strong testimony because if you look at the evidence for the Bible, there are counterproductive features that they call them, where if you were trying to start a new religion or lie about something, you would not put certain things in the Bible. So for example, the testimony of women was very much not considered reliable during this time. And it shows you that they didn't care what it sounded like. They were only concerned about giving facts. So that is the second one. So again, number one was the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. Number two was there was an empty tomb and a missing body. Number three, which might be the strongest piece of evidence, a lot of people think it is, was that the disciples believed that they had an experience where they heard, felt, and touched what they believed was Jesus Christ risen from the dead. And because of that experience that they believed, they were completely transformed. So if you think about it, the disciples were pretty much embarrassed the way that they handled a lot of these things that happened at the end of Jesus' life before the resurrection. They ran away and left him, right? They abandoned him. Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. But scholars will not deny that these experiences actually existed. In fact, there's a guy named Gerard Luderman, another New Testament scholar, who wrote a book this is such a well-attested fact that this is what they experienced that he wrote a whole book trying to explain it in a different way. His explanations was hallucinations, but I think we can't get into it again, but that's another theory that it doesn't hold a lot of water.
Then there is another, I think, there is another psychologist, I think, if I remember well, in Case of Christ, that says you can't have mass hallucination.
You can't have mass hallucination.
Hallucination is a personal experience. Yeah. You can't have 500 people hallucinate at the same time that they saw Jesus Christ. Right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's true. I was thinking about that too.
Without a help.
Without help, even with help.
Even with help.
I'm saying that's the way that it says without a help, because there's substances that you can provide to everybody.
Yeah.
Well,
That's what
500
I'm
people
saying.
on crack might see
Exactly.
They'll see different things.
There will
things, but
see
not the
different
same
things
thing.
that they could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You're right.
That's the way that they always say.
Yeah. So basically, these disciples, they were completely transformed to the point where they just turned the world upside down, with the resurrection of Jesus being the center part of what they were preaching. In fact, they were so transformed that not only did they preach this boldly, but they were willing to die for what they believed, and many of them did die. And I think this is an important part, because again, with the sermon of Peter and Pentecost, this is the same place he denied Jesus and feared for his life, yet he's boldly proclaiming that Jesus resurrected from the dead, not fearing for his life at this point. And something I always used to question was, what is the difference between modern day martyrs and martyrs from back then? Because we know that Peter actually did die as a martyr. Out of all of the theories of the disciples dying as martyrs, Peter's is one of the most sure ones that we know about. And Peter was crucified himself for his beliefs. So I used to wonder, well, what's the difference between modern day martyrs and the disciples being martyrs? Have you ever thought about that? So there is a difference, and the difference is that modern day martyrs are dying for something they believe based on what someone else told them. But these martyrs are eyewitnesses.
Right.
They are dying for something they know to either be true or to be false. Why would you die for something that you know to be false? Another quote that I was going to read, but we don't have time, was that he basically says, liars don't make good martyrs, which I think is very, very strong.
Compelling.
Yeah, very compelling. So this radical transformation allowed Christianity to grow very fast from Jerusalem and on beyond there. And then there are other theories that you can already discount. We know that the theory of Jesus resurrecting being a myth. So actually, the idea that Jesus' resurrection was a legend is probably the most popular theory right now. But it's crazy because that basically dismisses all of scholarship, Christian or not, because it doesn't even account for any of these facts. And like I said, these are eyewitnesses. There's no time for this to develop into some kind of myth. So you can already discount the idea that this was a legend. So that was 3. We have Jesus dying by crucifixion. The tomb was empty / there was a missing body. And the disciples had an experience that they believed was Jesus truly risen. And because of that experience, it transformed their lives completely. The last 2 facts, so that's 3, there's 2 more. The last 2 facts have to do with 2 skeptics contemporary to Jesus. Can you guess who they were? Paul was one of them.
Yeah.
So
Very
Paul.
good. Yeah.
And the other one was James. James, the brother of Jesus, right?
Yes,
So we'll talk.
his own brother.
Yeah. We'll get to James.
Jesus, of
He did
course.
not believe in,
He did not.
Christ at first.
At the
as being
beginning.
So I won't jump to that, but I think that's one of the most compelling. But first, Paul, very quickly.
Yeah.
So we know who Paul was. He was a persecutor of the church. And he too had an experience where he believed he had seen the risen Jesus. And that too transformed him to the point that he was willing to die for his beliefs. His impact on Christianity, I think we all know, his letters make up a lot of the New Testament, right? But this testifies that not only did friends testify to the resurrection, but a foe, an enemy in Paul, who was one of the strongest enemies of Christ, actually testifies to that as well. And Paul was beheaded by Nero, another martyrdom that we know to be a sure fact in history.
Right.
So Paul is interesting because he is the enemy of Christianity, the enemy of Christ, but he testifies to the resurrection. So,
By the way,
yeah.
great movie, Paul the Disciple.
You've seen it?
My wife and I
Yeah.
went to see it on Saturday.
I want to see it.
Great.
Nice.
Related to this subject because it's
yeah.
Luke's writing. It's Luke's visiting
Yeah.
Paul in prison. I'm just
No, yeah,
go ahead.
And I'm sorry, and
Yeah,
in
that's
that
fine.
movie, I just understood what you just said,
Mhm.
that who murdered Paul was actually converted by him.
Really?
The soldier looked like he was touched.
Yes.
He was touched, which would make sense because in Paul's letters, we studied one already, that all the household of Caesar
Right.
greet you.
Great.
Wow,
He
yeah.
mentioned it a couple of times.
Yeah.
So that means there were soldiers through his conversation with them,
Oh, yeah,
he
yeah.
became Christian. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So was that in the movie, or was
Yes.
is that something
That's
that's
in the movie.
It's in the movie.
Oh, so it's not known. It's just a.
No, it's
No,
not.
no,
It's not. It's
it's in
not
the
biblical, but
Okay.
it's in the movie. But there are scholars
It makes
who
sense.
Right.
wrote that
Right.
yeah, Paul was really beheaded, like you said, and that says that there were many soldiers who became Christian. In the movie,
Yeah.
they show
Yeah.
the jail owner kind of was touched, and
Yeah.
he will.
Yeah, don't tell me.
Yeah.
I want to watch. No, I'm just kidding.
Sorry.
I do want to watch it though.
Yeah.
There's a lot of movies. There's the other one that came out. What was the
There
other
was
one?
another
The
one.
Mercy
Me.
Magnificat.
God is not dead. The third one.
Yeah.
that one. There's the
other
Mercy Me
is-
one.
The Mercy Me is
About his
I-
father.
I can only believe.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
I can
I
only
can only
imagine.
imagine.
Okay.
Wonderful.
All right. So yeah, I heard that was a good movie too.
I have.
I saw that movie.
All right. So the last one is James's conversion. James is there's other James in the New Testament, but this is the brother of Jesus. Let me just read this part. Page. Actually, I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to summarize it. So James was one of Jesus' brothers, and there's a part of the New Testament where it says that his family did not believe. So he was a skeptic during the entire ministry that Jesus was doing before his crucifixion. But there is a creed in the New Testament from 1 Corinthians 15:3-7 where it does say that Jesus appeared to James. So at some point after his interaction with the risen Christ, he was convinced himself that Jesus truly did rise from the dead. And he also died as a martyr. So one of the passages from Josephus that testifies to Jesus is in conjunction with a testimony of James, the brother of Christ, dying a martyr's death. So that's another.
And I think in the same chapter as well, when Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem about concerning the circumcision question and so on, the leaders of the church were there,
Right.
and James is mentioned.
Yes, so he becomes
one of them.
one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, and I think that's also historically accurate. That definitely is historically accurate. So, coming from a family of 4 boys, this resonates very strongly with me because if you have siblings, you can probably think, what would it take for you to really testify that one of your siblings is God, is the Messiah, and died and became alive again? That's exactly what he was testifying, because I mean, your siblings grew up with you, they know everything about you. And there's another theory called the twin theory, which also used to bother me because I'm like, man, that could happen, I guess. The twin theory, as you can guess, is that Jesus had a long lost twin, and then after he died, he came onto the scene and he said, I've resurrected. But there's a lot of problems with that. So it might account for some of the things, but very easily they could have tested to see if that was real. I mean, James could have said a story that wasn't true and said, do you remember that? And he'll be like, yeah. And they're like, no, it never happened. And Mary was still alive, and I doubt if she kept, first of all, she probably wouldn't have kept the long lost twin from the entire family, and if she did, it's like she would have been able to say something.
Yeah,
So
that's crazy as the theory.
Yeah, that's a little crazy.
It is crazy.
yeah, so actually, I heard someone try to do a dissertation on this theory, and one of the Christian apologists set him up with a debate with William Lane Craig, who's one of the best Christian debaters right now, probably the best, maybe if not. And he completely dismantles the theory. And they took the debate and they sent it to all these publishers that were going to publish books about the twin theory, and no one ever published anything. So anyway, I was when I thought through it, I'm like, yeah, I'm glad I learned that and thought through that. But basically, the fact that his own blood brother, who was skeptical, had this experience, and the fact that he believed Jesus resurrected is a pretty strong piece of evidence. So these are the 5 facts. The fact that Jesus was crucified, he died by crucifixion, the tomb was empty, the disciples and apostles had experiences with what they believed was truly the resurrected Jesus, and because of that they were transformed. Paul, an enemy of Christ, was converted because of an experience with the resurrected Jesus, and in the same manner, James, his own blood brother, was also converted. So what you have to do next is, we've already talked about a lot of different theories that you've heard floating around, but you have to ask, which theory best accounts for all of these facts? And if you follow where the evidence leads, only the fact that Jesus bodily resurrected physically can account for all of these facts that have been attested in history through scholarship. So while these 2 books go through several pages, many different pages of alternate theories, you can automatically dismiss a lot of them just by knowing these 5 facts. So let me give you an example. We do have 5 minutes. I'll skip that example, but you can kind of see how it works because we've already done it with some of these theories. So now that you have this minimal facts approach, the conversation of the reliability of the Bible is separate. But if you add to that all the various evidence for the reliability of the Bible, the position that Jesus really did resurrect from the dead becomes so much more strong. So I think it's great that Paul knew it and we have it, all this body of evidence throughout the centuries. And I think for me, myself, learning this, it really allowed me to look at the resurrection, Easter, all this stuff, with a whole new set of eyes that really did strengthen my faith, because I've become somewhat of a skeptic myself when it comes to a lot of things in life, including what I believe. That's probably what draws me to apologetics. But learning this strengthened my faith, but it also gave me more confidence to talk to people. Because, I think growing up, it's like, I believe this, but I know you're going to think it's weird, Someone actually rose from the dead. But there is a whole body of evidence, medical, archaeological, historical, that supports this. So, for you guys, if there are things you didn't hear before, hopefully it does the same thing for you to kind of strengthen your faith.
Thank you very much.
That's
Sorry, it's a short time.
Oh, that's fine.
Because it could take the whole year, really.
Oh, yeah.
To go over that, but we'll do from time to time specials on special subject like this. But and though I appreciate the extra biblical techniques, evidence, and all of those to prove that the resurrection and Jesus Christ himself existed, I have to go back to the faith factor. Okay, and in terms of personally, that's my personal feeling and view, that I don't spend too much time with those doubters, to my detriment maybe, or maybe nonchalance. I go with kind of like, if there's a tree and there are several fruits and there's one all the way on the top, it's very difficult to get. And I have a bunch that are ripe, reaching the point. This is my approach. I go to the low hanging fruits. I go to those who are there, prepared. They want to believe. Right. They want to believe, but they want an extra.
You do a good job of that, Jonas.
They do an extra push. Thank you. Praise God. They need an extra push. To do that, and with the familiar, meaning the people who are already in my entourage, my family, my friends, my colleague. Now, I can do that in the street as well, but I go back to what Christ himself said. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he dies, he shall live. So Christ himself said it. And that's where I go to people with that faith factor. Do you believe this? And that's again, the professors, the scientists, all the people, they're going into these, and some people may need that. God, absolutely. I believe God has prepared people, maybe like you or Hank on the Graph, and all those great scholars to deal with these people, right? With the science, with the extra. But I go with what Christ himself has said.
It's interesting because I'm just like you, and I can easily just say it just is, But after hearing you today, I feel like there's a reason that you're here, arming us, like in a way that I've never really been armed before, and going into the times that we're approaching. I'm not sure, right? It could be time to have a little more. I don't know if I want to call it ammunition. I guess I want to call it ammunition, because I'm not prepared. Because for me, it's so easy for me to say, yes, it is. It just is. And I feel a little naked, vulnerable, and I'm like, okay, I hope he remembers to send his notes.
So the thing you mentioned this time, I think it's very true that we live in a different time. In the past, even as recent as me growing up, a lot of people, you could tell them something and they'll accept it. And they call it the new atheism, but society was not as aggressively attacking Christianity as they do today. But what I say about apologetics, and I'll always say it, is that I am not a fan of believing in something just because someone told you to believe it. And this is separate from faith. You know, your faith is not grounded in Scripture. It's more grounded because it's blind faith. Someone, your parents told you to believe it. That I'm not a fan of. Furthermore, there are a lot of people look at apologetics and this stuff, and they're like, people who go into the science and philosophy, they just want to argue. And I say, like, no, the people who just want to argue, I pray for discernment that I don't waste my time with them. And just bring me the people that really do question, because it is true that these are the things that hinder people from fully embracing Christianity. They might have grown up with it. They may not even believe in God because they don't think there's enough evidence. And that's fine, because I've questioned God's existence in the past, but the evidence is very strong. That's a whole different topic.
Right.
But when people come to ask me, I want to be ready to give an answer for why I believe it, but also so that they can also have some kind of thing that'll bring them to the next level in their own search, you know? And I don't want to waste any opportunity. And I've wasted, not that you waste opportunities, but
It's learning.
you know, learning opportunities. Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of different people in an army.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, like
absolutely.
if we were an army, there's a whole lot
Everyone
of
has a different
levels.
approach.
Everybody
Yeah.
has their
But-
role.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, where's the Lord going to place you, right?
Right.
So it's interesting, and you know, so please don't forget to
Oh,
send
I will.
your notes.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Now, I probably won't take it on exactly like you, with that deep fervor, but I want to have something on my back.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, you don't have to know all the details. Just
Yeah.
remember the 5 points.
Yeah, and the 5 points, like it's not like we already don't know it. It's
pretty
just
easy,
how to
yeah.
speak to it.
Right.
And I just feel
Are
like
very-
there's a reason, Rowan. I feel like there's a
We'll be
reason.
out.
We'll be out in a minute.
So wow. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm
Thank
glad you
you.
guys were
Thank you very
here.
much.
I thank God because he's the one who
Turn it on.
allows me to somehow
Yay.
Thank you, Lord, for Ro and for all of